only one market for your prisoners of war, and I'm it. James Donovan to Fidel Castro. The return of Evan Gershkovich from prison in Russia, along with 15 others, on August 1st was headline news all over the world, and an explosion of analyses followed. A trade of prisoners between nations is nothing new, but there were definitely new aspects to the exchange that went down in Ankara, Turkey. From Sarajevo to Red Africa discusses history, which generally means we try to stop our discussions about 30 years ago, because that history is not yet written. But the current events we see unfolding today are a direct result of events in the past. And that is absolutely, totally, fully true of the prisoner exchange in August 2024. This season, we're following current events back to their World War II genesis. But in this particular case, we couldn't. The two are just not the same. There were prisoner of war exchanges in World War II, but exchanges between nations involved in a hot conflict are governed by the Geneva Conventions. And, well, there have been attempts made to connect the U.S. to current hot conflicts. The Geneva Conventions also require the exchange of combatants. Exchanging prisoners of conscience and journalists, even with the label spy hastily slapped on their cases, is just not the same thing. And so, in this instance, we're not quite headed as far back in history. We'll be starting in February 1962 at an incident brought to the movie screen by Tom Hanks in his film Bridge of Spies. America had been horrified at the shootdown and capture of the U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers. And in the interest of honesty, public opinion was not on his side at all. He had not destroyed the plane, and he had not taken the poison that he traveled with. Whether or not Powers had the ability to actually complete these actions in the wake of his plane being taken out didn't seem to figure into the media narrative. But still, his continued incarceration in the Soviet Union was a terrible look. But the United States had its own leverage in the captured spy game. A man who gave his name as Rudolf Abel, one of the Soviet Union's most long-lived members of the so-called illegal program, which settled Iron Curtain intelligence officers in the West. Abel worked with the Rosenbergs, but managed to escape. He was later turned in by one of his partners and arrested in 1957 and then prosecuted as a spy in a case that brought the so-called hollow nickel into the pantheon of spy lore. The negotiations are the subject of the movie Bridge of Spies. Side note, reviews of its historical accuracy are easily available online. But the end result was a spy swap on a bridge between East and West Germany that included an American student being released at Checkpoint Charlie. While the Powers-Abel spy swap was a precedent setter, it didn't take long for another high-profile trade, this time involving the British. The Portland spy ring was run by Conan Moyody, a Soviet officer working with false Canadian papers under the name Gordon Lonsdale. Moyody was able to obtain classified information and have it sent to the Soviet Union via an American communist couple posing as antiquarian book dealers with New Zealand papers. Very complicated. Their entire operation was exposed and 5 people were arrested and prosecuted. While the British were holding a very successful Soviet officer, the Soviets had their own bargaining chip. A man named Greville Wynne, who had been arrested in conjunction with Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military officer who had passed information to the West. In fact, Wynne was arrested for working with Penkovsky and acting as a courier for the information Penkovsky sent back. some of which may have been instrumental in setting the course that was followed during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The United States' answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders, as they had been during past invasion scares.
Penkovsky was executed for his crimes, either shot, burned alive, or via suicide, depending on who tells the story. But Wynne was sentenced to prison. While Wynne and Melody were exchanged in 1964, the American communist couple Lona and Morris Cohen, the book dealers we talked about, were not exchanged until 1969, and for a far lower price. Two men convicted of drug offenses and a British professor of the Russian languages who had been arrested for distributing anti-Soviet leaflets within the Soviet Union. A rather new approach to exchanges took place in December 1976, when a Soviet dissident named Vladimir Bukovsky was exchanged in Zurich for the General Secretary of the Communist Party in Chile, Louis Corvalon. He had been arrested when Pinochet came to power, and the USSR had made him kind of a cause célèbre. But rather than a traditional exchange, the Soviet Union instead offered to strip the imprisoned activist Bukovsky of his Soviet citizenship and deport him, while at the same time receiving Korvalin. Bukovsky himself wasn't asked for his opinion. He was put in handcuffs and hustled to Switzerland. Perhaps jailing the irascible and highly visible human rights campaigner was proving a bit too much trouble within the Soviet system. A released European psychiatric report on Bukovsky's state of mind said, "The information we have about Bukovsky suggests he is the sort of person who might be embarrassing to authorities in any country because he seems unwilling to compromise for convenience and personal comfort." Asking Bukovsky if he wanted to be exiled probably would not have produced an answer his jailers wanted to hear. The 1980s brought a whirlwind dump of spy exchanges, beginning with the highly secretive exchange involving Günter Guillaume in 1981. Guillaume, who had appeared in West Germany in 1956 under orders to infiltrate the government, succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He became the secretary to Chancellor Willy Brandt, even sharing a holiday with the Brandt family. The Guillaume affair forced the resignation of the German chancellor, and so perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that the exchange of Günter Guillaume and 4 other Stasi officers for 8 from West Germany, the UK, and the US was done in extreme secrecy. The largest exchange in the 1980s took place in 1986. Karl and Hanna Kocher, Czech intelligence agents working for the Soviet Union, had managed to penetrate the deepest recesses of American intelligence, while also engaging in an entirely different sort of penetration at swinger parties. The thing about the Kochers was, at one point, Karl had actually tried to turn himself in to the FBI, which wasn't the least bit interested in his espionage confession. 1986 also saw the trade of the Polish spy Marian Zacharski. Zacharski served as the president of Polamco, the Polish-American Machinery Corporation, and in that capacity was able to gather extensive information relating to American radar and weapon systems. Zacharski would continue to affect world affairs. He was appointed, but never served, to the head of Polish civilian intelligence in 1994, and information he gave up in American interrogations about Soviet intelligence assets in the Polish system possibly led to the downfall of the Oleski government in 1996. In the 1986 exchanges, Soviet dissidents sent west featured prominently, although they were being held under charges of spying for foreign governments. Natan Sharansky was released and went to Israel, and Yuri Orlov, not to be confused with the Nick Cage character in Lord of War, a physicist and dissident, founding member of the Soviet branch of Amnesty International, was given the same deal as Bukovsky in 1976, stripped of his Soviet citizenship and exiled. But this same year saw an interesting tit for tat emerge when an American reporter in the Soviet Union, Nicholas Danilov, was arrested in retaliation for the American arrest of a member of the Soviet mission to the United Nations. Gennady Zakharov had been caught red-handed paying for classified documents. But proof of guilt often has little importance in national pissing matches. In fact, Danilov's case would cast an eerie echo more than 35 years later with the arrest of accredited journalist Evan Gershkovich in Russia. And this brings us back to the present, an exchange deeply rooted in history, but historic nonetheless. These exchanges have always provoked intense arguments in the West. Are we encouraging bad behavior by negotiating and carrying them out? We focused on the exchange of prisoners, but past exchanges have also included access to frozen funds for prisoners and other bargaining chips. No less than James Angleton argued strenuously against exchanging Francis Gary Powers for Rudolph Abel, under the idea that Powers had spilled all the beans he held, and Abel still had a lot of intelligence to give up. But Angleton was overruled. Vladimir Bukovsky didn't even want to be exchanged in 1976. But there's always more to it. The calculus of exchange and retain is as much art as science, and never straightforward. Rarely is an exchange one for one, and so how much is each prisoner worth? Nor is the exchange itself the end of the line. After the August exchange, Dmitry Medvedev tweeted, "And let the traitors now feverishly select new names and actively disguise themselves under the witness protection program." Medvedev is known for his rhetoric. However, the past is prologue in this. It was only a few years ago, in March 2018, that Sergei Skripal, a prisoner exchanged in 2010, was poisoned in Salisbury, England, with the nerve agent Novichok. Now, we can never give a complete and in-depth account of the history of prisoner exchanges in the Cold War in the 10 to 15 minutes we have in an episode of History, She Wrote. But we've hopefully given you a place to start. The world right now is in flux, and it's more important than ever to know and understand history if we're going to be a part of making a better future. The real stories are out there. We need to hear them.